Rubio, and I'm a member of the class of 2023 here at Columbia Business School. I'm also the chair of Cluster D23 and also help lead membership and admissions for the Hispanic Business Student Association. It's my pleasure to introduce the following session with Professor Valerie Purdie-Greenaway. Professor Purdie-Greenaway serves as director for the Laboratory of Intergroup Relations and the Social Mind. She's an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at Columbia University, core faculty for the Robert Wood Johnson Health and Society Scholars Program, and research fellow at the Institute for Research on African American Studies at Columbia. Dr. Purdie-Greenaway has authored numerous publications that have appeared in journals such as Science, Psychological Science, and Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. She was awarded grants from the National Science Foundation, Russell Sage Foundation, Spencer Foundation, and William T. Grant Foundation. Previously, Dr. Purdie-Greenaway served on the faculty at Yale University. She completed her doctoral work in psychology at Stanford University, and she completed her undergraduate work at Columbia College and was a varsity basketball player. Previously, Dr. Purdie-Greenaway served, please note that the audience will have a chance to ask questions towards the end of the session. And also, as a reminder, this conference is a Phillips Pathway for Inclusive Leadership, or PPIL, our co-curricular program aimed at equipping CBS students with the essential skills and strategies necessary to lead in an inclusive and ethical manner across industries. Today's session will focus on the DEI topics of mitigating bias and prejudice, creating an inclusive environment, communicating across identities, and gender identity and equity. To receive PPIL credit, MBA students must attend at least one session of the conference and make sure to check in at registration. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Purdie-Greenaway. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I am absolutely delighted to be here. My name is Valerie Purdie-Greenaway, she, her, hers, and I am going to sort of share some insights, both from what we know about women in tech and Okay, yes, thank you. So I'll be sharing some insights today from the view of a scientist's bench. So few confessions before we start. This is probably my first in-person presentation in quite a long time, and I'm now wondering why does anyone wear heels? So I don't know how long these will stay on. Maybe the whole presentation, maybe not. But also this is sort of my inaugural talk in this building, and it is just absolutely wonderful to sort of see this sort of all coming together. I remember when it was a hole in the ground. I was a alum of Columbia College, and I was here before this was even a vision. So it's really just spectacular to be here. So I want to sort of start off with a story about a pretty challenging project that I was working on. And this is a project that involved quite a bit of technology. And I'm sort of interested in the question of credible information and evidence related to gender diversity in technology. It requires machine learning and fuzzy matching and computational neuroscience. And I was talking to a potential funder to try to get funding. And one of the things that I found myself doing in this moment of trying to talk about this very complicated project was I started asking myself questions like, I'm trained as a social psychologist. I'm trained as someone who designs experiments, but maybe I should go back to school and learn computational neuroscience. And I'm thinking, oh, maybe I need to sort of go back to school and learn machine learning. I also found him sort of asking me questions to sort of probe and prod at my sort of technical prowess and expertise. And one of the things I found myself thinking about was, well, for this project, I had assembled a team of experts. I knew how to do some of those things, but the skills that I have are related to leadership, also experimentation, design, thinking about the big picture. So what is it about this context that sort of forces me to start thinking in a much more narrow way, just about skills and do I have the skills that it takes, rather than the big picture? So this is one of the things that we know that is related to the experience of being a woman of color in technology, as well as just women in tech more generally, and in all of the various intersections. That when you have some kind of identity that's sort of underrepresented in some way, oftentimes you are sort of asked to meet a different set of standards and expectations, but also you start worrying and thinking about them. So this is sort of the world of the kind of science that I do. So for the past 15 years, I'm a social psychologist, and what I try to do is I try to understand what it is about the context that we find ourselves in that shape our behaviors. And the sort of angle that I use is what I call insider-outsider dynamics, which is something that many of you have probably heard before. But what I try to do is I try to understand the science and the neuroscience and the physiology under it. What we know about insiders is that insiders are oftentimes people who have established connections. Oftentimes they're members of majority groups. They have access to formal and oftentimes informal sources of power. They oftentimes either fit into established norms, or sometimes it may be the case that the norms have sort of been created for them. Outsiders are those who might have less of those things. They might have more difficulty accessing information. They might have informal sources of power, but may have less access to formal sources of power. And what we know is that each one of us can be insiders or outsiders depending on the context that we find ourselves in, the industry that we find ourselves in, the courses that we find ourselves in, and it shifts over the course of our career. Sometimes when I talk about this in different types of executive sessions, you'll hear people say that they can look at their calendars and they can determine in what meetings do they feel like insiders or outsiders. So I want to sort of use this frame to think about some of the challenges related to women in technology, both what we know from the industry perspective, and then a little bit of like, what do I do, or how do I think about it? And the world that I live in is I try to look at a variety of different groups, not just women in technology, women in business. I try to look at very difficult doctoral programs in STEM and STEAM, and I try to understand what it is about these environments, what are the consequences of it, and then what are ways to design interventions to sort of change people's experiences so they can thrive there. So that's where I'm going. So I want to start off with this idea about what it takes to get ahead, lessons from women and men in tech. And as I was sort of preparing for this presentation, I was saying, okay, well, what's out there in the industry? And a lot of research is really starting to come together to tell a very coherent story about technology, about the experiences of technology. And even what you'll find is that I'm going to share the results of a survey that just came out, and it very much aligns quite nicely with the panel that we heard earlier. So this is a study that was conducted through Boston Consulting Group, who published a report, and they were looking at leaders, both women and men, who have made it to the top. So they're either leaders in the business units or in the technology units. They're either 1 or 2 levels below the C-suite. And what they did is they conducted surveys with them, so it was about 750 of them, and then for an additional 70, they did in-depth interviews. And some of the things that you'll find are quite sort of axiomatic. It's something that we saw earlier today. It's something that we probably all know, is that, but it's always, I think, useful to start here, that when you sort of ask questions about what it takes to get to the top, when you look back, how do you sort of think about things like ambition and inspiration? What you find reliably is that there are no gender gaps in ambition, roughly the same percentage of women and men. They're trying for the same kinds of promotions. So this is always sort of the ground floor that I think is important to start with, although for many of us in this room, it's kind of obvious. But what becomes really interesting is what are the places where men and women agree, and then where are there areas where women say, well, their sort of leadership style in technology did something a little different. So there's a lot of different survey questions, but I thought I'd just sort of illuminate 4 of them that I think are really interesting and fit quite nicely with the panel earlier. One of them is they sort of asked these respondents the question of, what do you think was most important to reach the senior level role? And where you see agreement is both women and men says setting vision is the most important thing. Motivating teams is incredibly important. Executing strategy is less important, but still incredibly important. But the one place that you do see gender differences emerge is that women are more likely than men to say that they feel like both are being questioned more about their advanced technical skills, and they also feel the pressure to sort of demonstrate that they have them. And so here's sort of a quote that is related to this, and it's the idea that technical proficiency bias is real. This person says, that she was talking about her boss, and her boss was saying to her, he said, you aren't the most technical person, but you can still have effective conversations with senior engineers. And she says to herself, I had the capabilities to do the job, but I was still being held to a technical standard that wasn't meaningful. And that's kind of interesting in sort of the way I sort of started off this presentation today. The second thing, and so what I think is sort of interesting, here's just a quote from a friend of mine. He is a CEO of a tech startup, Escalera. We went to Columbia College together. He worked for Goldman Sachs for 19 years. One of the things that I think is so fascinating is that even though Goldman Sachs has a really sort of high-powered technical team, he is the head of HR. He was the head of HR for 19 years. And the most important things he talks about is leadership related to building teams and motivating teams. This is him when he came to speak in my negotiations course. And he says, if you're thoughtful at all, you know that you're only as good as the team that you have. To me, if you get up out of bed and you're not worried about the state of your team, you're basically not being a good manager. And I thought that that's really important to demonstrate that the vision, the leadership is actually more important in many ways. That's what's going to be the driver of what makes technology companies successful. Second, when you ask the question, which promotion in your career do you consider most pivotal? And is it sort of early on in your career, so those first initial kinds of promotions, or later on in your career? And what you find is that when it comes to your very first promotion, women are slightly more likely to say that their first promotion was important. There really aren't gender differences when it comes to second promotions, but really what you see is a pretty big divergence when it comes to third or later promotions, such that sort of the male leaders who have made it to the top are saying, well, later on they had these big promotions, and the women are very much less likely to say that. And that's quite consistent with what we heard in the panel earlier today. And so here's a quote that's sort of related to this. This is Stephanie Carrillo, who's COO at Box. And she says, I go back to the beginning of my career in my 20s when I took a first-time management role for IBM in Australia. Our boss encouraged all of us right at the beginning of that journey. If not for her initial nudge, I'm not sure if any of us would have done it on our own. And the idea being that when women that are sort of at the top are reflecting back on their careers, they're saying those early breakthrough moments are really important for them. Third, when you ask the question, do you believe changing employers was critical for your career advancement, this idea of disruption, of having to either move to a different city, potentially a different country, potentially a different industry, potentially a different sort of job market altogether to sort of get the experiences you need to advance to the top, what you find is that, again, no gender differences in terms of the percentage of men and women saying that, yes, this is very critical versus, helpful but not required versus not required. Clearly, this is something that every single person is saying is important when they look back on their careers. But what is really interesting is when you ask the question, how many employers have you had, including your current employer, you start to see gender differences at the number that's about greater than 5. What you're seeing here is that when you look at gender differences and you look at men who have made it to the top, they may have had 5 different either industry shifts or career shifts or shifts in employers, less so for women. And here's, I think, a third interesting quote that I think is related to this, there's a woman, Sue Barsmian, who says, I think you're more likely to make disruptive moves when with people you know and trust you. It's the trust network that pulls you into disruptive moves, whether in your current company or across companies. So again, this idea that networks are incredibly important, but that when you have a network that you trust, it feels like it can kind of make you do things that are exciting and different. And for me, as a person who is a psychologist and a behavioral scientist, I'm always interested in what it is about the context. And here it's like these networks pull people to do exciting things. It's not just that people are more adventurous, they're in a network that allows them to do exciting things. And then finally, when you ask the question, how long has your most influential mentor supported you? I think, again, this is very much connected to the previous question related to the trust network. What you find is that on the top, you're looking at how long has your most influential mentor supported you. Less than 2 years, women are more likely to say yes. 2 to 5 years, you see no gender differences. When it's greater than 5 years, you've had the same mentor for over 5 years, like a very long time in your career, men are more likely to have these individuals. And there's sort of two things going on. One of the things that you find is that as women advance, they feel like they need different people to help you, but also their mentors and allies sometimes fall off as they move. So there's sort of an interplay between the two. So again, this idea of having a network and sustaining your network, including your mentors and allies, is incredibly important. Okay. So what we know from this, survey is that technical proficiency bias is real, that breakthrough moments that come early seem to matter most. Changing employers is critical to advancement, but women may consider a broader work-life landscape, just sort of a broader set of parameters. And keeping early career mentors is really important, but also to be open to new ones as your career evolves. So this is what we heard from this survey, but for those of us that are in the room, I know you're a little bit farther apart, what I'd like you to do is to try to just move over and meet someone for just a minute. When you look at the Google Women of Color Summit, which started last year, so their first ever summit to bring together women of color in technology and all of their intersections, one of the speeches that Michelle Obama gave is she talked about this idea of women in technology, and she said, the only way people will know us and our complexities is if we share our stories. So what I'd like to do, the two of you are sitting together, not everyone's sitting together, but if you just take 2 minutes, for those of you that are in the room, this is your opportunity to share your story with the person sitting next to you, or maybe you could sort of move over and just say a little hello. You'll each have a minute to sort of share your story with each other. I'm not going to ask you what it is, but what I'm curious about is, do these survey results speak to what you know about women in tech? So both in terms of your own experiences, other people that you've talked to, if you're an ally, do these experiences resonate? And I'll just give you about 2 or 3 minutes. So I actually want you to talk to each other. For our friends that are virtual, you will just have a moment or two to reflect about it. So I'm going to let you move. You actually, and you're all staring at each other, you should actually like get up, turn around, say something to each other. You have to actually like get off your phone, look at each other, say hello, actually talk to each other, share your story. And what I'm curious about is, why are you here in terms of women in tech? Are you an alum? What's your experience? And do these survey results resonate? Okay, I'll just give you like 2 minutes. Yeah. Kylan, maybe just. Okay, so you have about 1 more minute. Always fun to figure out who's sitting next to you, what their name is, what their story is. Okay, so if you could all come back together, thank you so much. Hopefully you got to meet someone, make a friend. 1 or 2 thoughts. When you think about the survey, you think about the panel this morning, did any of this resonate either with your own story, what you've heard, your mentors, your allies, or is there something completely different that you know about what it takes to get to the top that we're missing? There's probably there's lots of things that we're missing, but anyone, just 1 or 2 people. Yes.
I think having that early, a mentor and someone who helps promote you really early on, like structure as well over the years.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So one of the comments is the idea and you're saying it resonates with you in terms of what you've heard, the idea of having an early career breakthrough moment and also having a mentor to kind of push, or is has that happened to you, or is that just something that you keep hearing over and over? Oh, interesting. That's something that's happened to you as well. Yeah, I would agree. That has definitely happened to me as well. I would never be a professor if I didn't have someone say, like, what are you doing? You should absolutely be a professor, and this is how you do it, and like early in my career. Another person, does this resonate? Does either the results of the survey resonate either with any part of your own career, or is there something that's missing, or with the panel, maybe one other? Yes?
I find it very interesting, the statistic about how men's mentors might stay with them for a longer time. In a previous discussion in class a few weeks ago, there had been some comments about how, especially in today's environment, men are comfortable helping women in the workplace if it's related to their job, but might not maintain that relationship for years prior because of feeling of male-female dynamics. So I thought that was particularly compelling.
Oh, that's interesting. So the idea, so I thought it was interesting too. I just was sort of curious why, but so the idea that men may have mentors that stay with them for a long period of time, the idea that maybe they're sort of blending kind of social and job related things, or eventually they might become good friends. Whereas when it's a sort of a male-female dynamic might be just limited to, I want to help you, but only in the context of work. Oh, that's interesting. I don't know the answer to that, but that is certainly worth some research. I don't know the answer to that, but that is certainly, and in this survey, it was not clear why that actually happens. Yes?
Hi. So I found the survey results of how many times a woman or a man changed employers. I found that result quite interesting because it's almost like saying that men at the top who have changed employers more than 5 times is almost expected or accepted, whereas women, the responses have been less than the men. Is it because women are kind of expected to have more loyalty to their employers,
Yes.
or more committed to the job, to that manager, to that company? So I found that gap quite interesting.
So I would agree. I find that gap interesting as well. One of the things that's always fun but frustrating about survey results is that you don't know why that is. I sort of suspect that one of the challenges related to DEI and equity and underrepresentation is, from not everyone, but sometimes when you are a member of an underrepresented group and you're like, I need to move on, people, they're like, oh, please don't leave. Like, we really need you. And there's very few of you, and we need more. And, so there's all of this kind of, it's not like you're sort of like representing something bigger, which you are, but then all of us are. But so you may not be encouraged to move on. That might be one thing, as well as you may not move on. I don't know why, but I think it's very interesting to think about. Yes. Yeah. So good. So these are some survey results, and what they, to me, sort of suggest, and what we think about is this idea that when you look back and you're looking at people at the top, there are way more similarities than differences, but there are a few differences when it comes to the paths that women and men take to get to the top. So what I want to, I had sort of like many different studies that I wanted to share, but I just want to sort of share one, because one of the things that I try to do is I try to sort of take what I call a micro look at these insider-outsider dynamics. One of my sort of specialties is to try to go into companies and organizations, and I try to leverage psychology, particularly in what I call stressful, threatening environments where people are underrepresented, environments where people are historically marginalized, environments where we know there's either racism, sexism, homophobia, heterocentrism, all of these isms. And I asked the question, are there kind of psychological tools and experiences that we can use to sort of protect people or help people to cope, knowing that really what needs to happen is that these environments need to change. But as that happens slowly, what kind of psychological armor can we give people? So this is something that I've been working on for quite a long time. And so one question that I ask is, can psychological interventions that are known to reduce stress and threat and anxiety, particularly they're sort of well established in the health literature, can they be used to help cope with difficult transitions? And one of the things that I study is the transition to STEAM and STEM doctoral programs, particularly looking at women and men and their intersections. One of the reasons why I sort of look at that area is one of the things that we know is that the end game, if you're interested in computational science or math or physics or any of these areas, is tremendous. But over 50% of women and men who enter these PhD programs drop out. So even if there's a big promise, either financially in terms of your intellectual reward, it is a high rate of dropouts, and the rates are higher for women and members of underrepresented groups. And so one of the things that I work on, there's a variety of different interventions that I work on, but there's a whole sort of literature that I don't have time to get into that comes from the health psychology literature that says the following. When you are in stressful and threatening environments, what most people think is that you should sort of lean in, dig in, work harder, all of those things. But actually that's not true. All that does is that it increases stress. But if you, in that moment, start thinking about your values, your friends, your family, your religion, your music, your sense of humor, like what makes you you, your real core values, not the company values, not the Columbia values, your own values, what it does is that it can sort of temporarily reduce stress and anxiety just enough to give you like a little bit of a bigger perspective. This is called values affirmation. You can do it by sort of writing about your core values. You can do it by sort of looking at your core values, say on like, just like a little like wristwatch. We text people their core values when we ask it to them, like sort of years before. So there's lots of ways, but the idea is that the thing that most people think they should do in stressful moments is sort of lean in and work harder. But what most people don't do is they don't sort of take a step back and say, I am bigger than this moment. So that's what these values affirmations are. It's a psychological experience that reminds people in moments of stress that they're good, they're moral, they're able to achieve outcomes. It's very different than self-esteem. I could talk about that if you're interested. And what we know from lots of papers that I and others have published is that it does lots of great stuff. We know it reduces stress when you look at the neuroendocrine system. It allows people to see the big picture. It reduces defensiveness. It increases your sense of belonging and connectedness. And we also know it's linked to actually increasing sort of cognitive performance because you're not doing double duty, wondering like, oh my gosh, I'm really stressed out. So what we did at Columbia University and several other universities is we ran a series of what are called randomized controlled experiments when doctoral students were first entering, because we know that the first 8 weeks are the biggest predictor of whether or not you're going to drop out. And what we were interested is, could we use something like this in a novel way to sort of increase people's sense of belonging, and would you find differences between women and men? So this is sort of rests on a lot of different work, but what we know is that sort of having doctoral students just write about their values is kind of not really all that compelling to them. So what we did is we did a smartphone study where we asked them, we said the following: as you go through your daily life, you may see or experience things that remind you of your values. Values refer to things in your life that make you happy, that give you a sense of meaning or purpose. Sometimes we might miss these things, or we're not paying close attention to them. What we asked people to do is we asked them to just take a picture of things around them that remind them of their values and then write about it. So here's an example of what this looks like. And so we have literally thousands of these. They're actually incredible. And so this is a woman in astronomy and who's getting her PhD. And she sent this picture in, and she said, this is a picture from the top of Mount Tamalpais, where some friends and I did a great hike on last year's July 4th. It reminds me, one, how much I love living in the Bay Area with beautiful scenes like this so close to my home, why I love being a grad student. For the first 2 years, you get to look at a bird's eye view of a field, take classes, ask broad swooping questions, and then find the part of that beautiful, complicated vista below that you want to better understand. It's really, really cool. So the idea is that she's really tapping into her own values. The question of interest is, what is the impact of this on people's sort of sense of belonging during those first critical weeks of their doctoral program? So on the x-axis, what you're looking at is their weeks in school. We use a smartphone analysis because we can sort of just tag people every day, and we ask, what is your sense of belonging, along with other kinds of questions. On the y-axis is just a measurement of belonging. And we do this with women and men. So in the purple, what you see is that men's sense of belonging is sort of relatively high, and it kind of sort of, those sort of modulations are not particularly, they're not significant. In the green, you see in the control condition with women, what you find is that you start to see a linear decline in your sense of belonging in a doctoral program that you probably spent your whole life getting into in the first 8 weeks. But for those that are in our treatment condition, they write about these values that are meaning to them, you start to see this sort of linear increase, these critical first weeks, these 8 weeks of their doctoral program, you start to see this increase in sense of belonging. What we also see, which I don't have time to share with you, is that you see an increase in the number of times they start meeting with their mentors, even when they think their mentors are very difficult. You see stronger connections in terms of their publications, and so what you start to see is this, what we call sort of a positive cascading effect that seems to be predictive of retention and persisting in these really difficult, stressful environments. So the lesson that I always take from this is not so much we need to be running around in technology, sort of, making people write about their values. It's what I think about is, what is it about the environments that industries create that focus on their own values, and how can we either create greater alignment with our own values, or what is it about these environments that are so threatening and stressful that when you spend your whole life to get in them, they actually start to erode your sense of belonging the minute you get there. So what we know is that insider-outsider dynamics affect our psychology, our social networks, our social capital, and our performance. And what I want to close with is a friend of mine has sort of been following this work, and this is not sort of empirical work. This is just a project. She's a professor, Robin Bell, does really cool work looking at the Arctic glaciers and their melting rate. So she spends months and months and months at the North Pole, and she's a professor here in geoscience. She saw the research that our lab has been doing, and she said, can we actually use these this idea of photographs and writing about your values related to women in computational science, in physics, and math. So she wrote this letter. She actually sent it to me, but she wrote this letter, and it's a very long letter, but I just took an excerpt out of it, and it says the following. Women in science have long suffered with the gut-wrenching feeling that the playing field is not level. Now we have the words to describe what happens in science research that skews the process towards men. We have the data to demonstrate how insidious the bias is. What should I tell my daughter? Her daughter is interested in the same type of geoscience that she's interested in, and she is beyond the doctoral level. I don't want to discourage her, but she knows the science, and she reads the literature, and she knows the score. One form of armor is reinforcement of love of scientific inquiry. My daughter and I made a joint, very geeky New Year's resolution. We resolved to help each other put on armor each week using a technique I learned from a friend, Valerie, who's tried it in middle schools to support students who might not succeed due to persistent stereotype, threat, and worries. My daughter and I will start each week writing a note to each other about the beauty of our science and include a picture to go with it. So this is a picture that her daughter made of her own research. This is what a snowflake looks like underneath a microscope. And this is what she says. She says, science is simply the lens through which I see the world. Whether it is the patterns in deep ice radar, the snowflakes in my microscope, or searching the UGG's earthquake catalog before I get out of bed to understand the thump in the middle of the night. Science is my framing. I get joy from solving puzzles and decoding patterns and looking at things in new ways. Each observation is an advance, small or large. Once a scientist, always a scientist, regardless of one's actual job. I do science because it makes me laugh with the simple wonder at working on nature's puzzles. And I just want to share another one that a friend of her wrote. So this is a woman in physics, and she works in industry. And this is her photograph of a sort of sine wave looking at the molecular level. And she says, I love what I do. Physics is like a puzzle, and I'm in my element. I'm lost in the unfolding of layer after layer of interaction. And you could see the layer of interaction. It's actually quite beautiful. An experiment is a window through which we peer, trying to open boxes on the other side with our eyes. We can use the knowledge passed to us by those before to uncover mysteries that they would have never dreamed of, or to illuminate truths thought to be inaccessible. It is a process with a deep history and a deep future, and to tread its path is a gift. And so this part is sort of not the sort of science. We don't know if sort of empirically that, Robin's idea was to create a website, and then you could sort of have women sort of post these and then read each other's. And I think it's a phenomenal idea. And maybe one day we'll be able to get it funded. But I think the idea and the connection related to, how do you ascend related to women in technology is that I find myself in these kinds of presentations often where we talk about strategy, we talk about negotiation, we talk about promotion, we talk about the barriers, but we rarely focus on the idea that most of us are here because we love what we do, whether it's the strategy, whether it's the technology, whether it's the computational algorithms, and figuring out ways to connect to that kind of value, I think, is going to be incredibly important. And this is something that I think industries really need to take seriously. Not their values, but ours. So I want to close by just saying the following, that each of us have a vision to share, and that is the vision that is really critical to our ascent in terms of making a difference in the lives of everyday people. And that's what technology is. That's when technology is at its best. There's also a whole world out there. Each of us are very different. Intersectionality is our strength as women. It's not something that divides us. It's something that brings us together. This is Audre Lorde saying there's no such thing as single issue struggles because we do not live single issue lives. And one of my favorite quotes of all time is that something we never talk about, how important it is for us to continue to support each other. We need allies and sponsors of every race, gender, sexual orientation at all of our intersections. But there is a special place in hell for women who do not help other women. This is Madeleine Albright. So with that, I want to close and say thank you very much for your time and for your attention and your persistence. So thank you. Do we have time for questions? So we have time for a few questions. I'm just going to grab some water. Yes, I have water. Thank you so much. I'm shocked that I still have these shoes on. I think if I were in California, I would have taken them off by now. I want Eric to get back.
I have a question from our online cohorts. Tess Mateo asks, about your mentor study, do you know if they were also quote unquote sponsors who helped with these promotions?
For which study?
About your mentorship study.
So that's a great study. So that's a great question. In our studies, what we do is it's a PhD program. So we know that in the PhD program, every person has, it's called a faculty advisor. You're actually supposed to have several. All of that data we've actually coded. So we know not just who your faculty sponsor is, but what is your lab like? What's the culture of that lab? Do they have outside sponsors? But that data we haven't been able to link up to the belonging data. But what I do know, just from lots and lots of years of consulting and other things, is that particularly when you look at the way women perhaps, or I think sort of people that just are underrepresented, the way you move through very stressful environments, is that you have both like your mentor, person, boss, and that's sort of like one person that you need to get sort of critical feedback from. But then you should always have someone that's in your industry but outside of your company, or in your industry but like not in if you're in a PhD program, not in your department. Because you want someone who can sort of understand the broader landscape and understand your potential, and those people are less likely to see you through these biased and stereotypical ways. So that kind of inside person and outside person together winds up being a really powerful formula. So so that's kind of what the to-do is. In our studies, we are able to analyze it, but I don't know if it's linked to belonging in those studies. Questions or comments? Yes.
So I'm the mic runner, but I have a question. So the kind of going back off the mentorship study, I've heard previously that one of the reasons why women don't maintain, I know this is kind of building off of Rachel's question from the chat, but one of the reasons why women don't maintain mentors later in their career is because there's so few women in a lot of those senior positions that as you transcend all these different ranks, you end up in a place where you are the person that all these women are looking to be their mentor.
Yes.
And that's one of the reasons why you see that shedding.
Yes.
Can you speak to, and then also I think that a lot of the women in those positions, they get overwhelmed by all of the women who are seeking, like we want to of course do what Mrs. Albright says, but also you end up maybe overstressing yourself. Yeah. So I know you talked about value, but is there a way in which people who are at that level can decide how they're going to allocate their resources and the most effective way of doing that?
Yeah, so I actually was part of this team that just wrote a Harvard Business Review article about, and part of it was about how do you negotiate these kinds of things? How are they valued? How do you negotiate them? How do you quantify them? And there's sort of a couple of things. One is when you look at that mentorship data, I actually think it's a little curious. I'm not sure why it is the case that you see this huge drop off. My suspicion is that you're partly right, that it is the case that as women move up, they're the only ones, and then there's just sort of no one else. I think the other thing is that when you have some kind of outsider identity, your sort of path to the top is sort of like a lattice, kind of, it goes like this. And so what this means is that the person that you needed before is not the person that you need now. So you wind up sort of collecting different people. I also think the sort of relationship piece, like does someone just turn into a buddy? I think that's another element of it. There's another element of it. There's other research showing that oftentimes women are mentored by, when they are mentored by men or senior women, they're already senior. And if you're in an industry where you're like senior at 50, you're sort of gone. So then you're not sort of formally mentored anymore. So I think that there's a lot of reasons, and so I think, you know, what it is that women can do. When I talk to a lot of different, you know, women at the top, I think that there are several different strategies. I think one is women are completely, everyone is overworked, and I think you see that women take on this added burden of mentoring, but they don't see it as a burden. They see it as sort of a consistent and aligned with their values. So they see it as something that brings them joy, something that brings them passion, something that they like to do. So the challenge with that is that it's oftentimes doesn't translate into, you know, promotion opportunities. It doesn't, so it winds up being something that brings you joy, but it doesn't wind up sort of being part of your sort of leadership credo. Or it's something that people say, hey, thanks so much. Well, really, can you do X, Y, and Z and all these other things? So, but what you also see consistently is even though women in leadership and in technology know these things, they continue to do it. And so you just see this tremendous sort of burnout and workload. So, you know, my answer to it, or when I look at sort of what women do, it's the ones that really try to leverage it and turn it into part of their job, because they still love it, they still value it, they think it's important, they're going to do it anyway. But it's like, if I'm going to do this, and this is incredibly important for the future of the company, there's got to be one or two other things that I'm not doing, and sort of helping people understand what that landscape is. And mentorship is leadership. That is part of what you're supposed to do, but it has to be sort of, you know, valued in a way that doesn't seem sort of instrumental. Like, I'm helping these people, so therefore I shouldn't do this. That's not but it is like, I am helping to sort of bring forward the next generation. This takes time and energy. What is something else that I can take off my plate, but as I sort of stay at this level of sort of ascent and et cetera. So, yeah, it's a difficult conundrum, and what you hear a lot of is like, you know, just a lot of sort of extra work, but it's also work that many women love. Yeah, thank you.
This is just a me question now. How do you think companies can take your research and the idea of personal values and implement it in order to help their employees succeed?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think about this. A lot. I remember I was giving a talk at this one tech company, and they were like, "Well, we want you to give a presentation, but we don't want you to sell anything." And I was like, "I'm a professor. I don't have anything to sell, and because if I did, I'd sell it." Like, I don't know how to sell anything. That's why I'm a scientist. But I have a couple of thoughts. One is I actually see it in the inverse way. And what I mean by that is the extent to which getting people to reflect about their core values and what it means to sort of be who you are, that you're not just a worker in that moment, the dramatic effects that it has on reducing stress, it has effects on your performance, motivation, retention, health outcomes, to me speaks as a diagnostic tool to just how stressful workplace environments are, and technology companies in particular, and massages and showers and gyms is not going to help. So that I think is number one. Number two is I think that there's a myth that the company values are my values. So, you know, that, you know, I want to change the world with, you know, virtual reality. Yes, that's probably why you took the job, but that's still like not what makes you human. And I think that there's a disconnect that I think means that these environments, even though there's like these amazing sort of visionary people there, they're still day to day, like incredibly stressful, and, you know, 25% of people, they hemorrhage people every year. So, you know, that really needs to change, and it's changing far too slowly. And then I think that the third piece, which I'm sort of less clear about is like, can you actually sort of introduce these values into the workplace? And it has been done, but it's always done when people either do it themselves or through like a third party, or because as soon as a company turns it into a program, like, let's just all go up to the alumni suite and like talk about our values. Now it becomes performative, and now it becomes another source of stress. And so it has to be agentic, and it has to be authentic. So if there is a way to do that, you know, even through like sort of either a free app or, you know, something like that, that's the mechanism. I've even seen this. I've had you know, tech leaders come to me and say, you know, during the interviews, you know, I want people to be less stressful, so I ask them to talk about their values. And it's like, yeah, my values are just make as much money as this company. I mean, it's completely inconsistent. So the authenticity is the key, and that's the piece. So it can't be monetized. It can't be sort of linked to HR. So that's the piece that I've been thinking a lot about. How do you do that? Yeah, thank you. So I think that is our time. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and we will turn it back over. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. I just want to give a very, very special round of applause to Valerie. Just let's be as loud as we can. I just want to say that she has so much stuff going on, and she really squeezed us in. So Valerie, thank you so much. The next session will start in about 10 minutes, so please stick around.